Today we're having a look at this little handheld device that was kindly sent over, the rather quirkily named Powkiddy RGB10 Max 2. Let me just start by saying that I haven't used handheld emulation devices like this for many years. The last time I did was with this, the GP2X Wiz, released in 2009. This was much smaller, but I absolutely loved it and used it for many years. Since then, I've only really had a modified PSP with emulators installed, which I still have. Why am I mentioning this? Well, I just want you to understand that I'm reviewing the RGB10 Max 2 from the perspective of someone who hasn't really used handheld emulation devices for a long time. I'm not comparing this to other devices out there because I have no frame of reference, so all I can do is say whether or not I like it and note any pros and cons. The Max 2 is an upgraded version of their previous RGB10 Max and has several improvements. The most notable being the more ergonomic shell, which has these grips on the sides to ensure a more comfortable gaming experience, especially for prolonged sessions. The box it came in is very minimal, plain with the Powkiddy logo, and inside it's equally as sparse, having only a USB-C charging cable and a very brief quick start guide that pretty much only tells you the layout of the buttons and ports. This one is black with white buttons, but the reverse colour scheme is also available, as well as a pink version, and I think there are also all white and all black versions. The shell is made from hard plastic and seems sturdy. It has a D-pad, 2 analog sticks, start and select buttons at the bottom, 4 face buttons labelled in the Super Nintendo style, and 2 more extra buttons at the top. The face buttons are quite raised up, far more than say the Nintendo Switch, and as a result they wiggle around quite a bit. They feel more rubbery when compared to the Switch's clicky buttons too, but not really an issue. They feel good when you're playing a game and are nice and responsive. And there are 4 shoulder buttons, 2 standard which are quite sunken into the shell itself, so there isn't much movement, but they work fine and can be clicked regardless of where on the button you press, although it does require less effort if you press them towards the outer ends. And 2 lovely triggers. These are surprisingly satisfying with a really nice springy feel to them, very similar to the Nintendo Switch's triggers, although these depress slightly further. The D-pad is fairly good. It's certainly not the best I've used, but it feels quite smooth and I had no problem pulling off moves in Street Fighter. For the majority of games I'm using it for, it does the job. The analog sticks are very nice indeed. Looking from the side you can see that they have a low profile relative to the device, being recessed quite deep into the shell. They're smooth and responsive, have a good range of movement, and I can't fault them. They are also clickable, acting as extra buttons just like those on the Switch. So clearly some inspiration was taken from the Switch here, particularly when comparing the analog sticks and the triggers, and that's no bad thing. Speaking of the Nintendo Switch, let's compare the RGB10 Max to it in size. The depth is almost identical. The RGB10 Max 2 is 19.2cm wide at its widest point, where the Switch is 23.5cm. It's 7.5cm high versus the Switch's height of 9.7cm. The Switch of course has a 6.2 inch screen, larger than the RGB10 Max's 5 inch IPS screen. The Max 2 weighs 224 grams while the Switch weighs 414. That means that the Max 2 weighs 1.55 grams per square centimetre and the Switch weighs 1.81 grams per square centimetre, so the Max 2 weighs about 85% of the Switch centimetre for centimetre. Going on screen size alone, the Switch weighs 66.8 grams per inch of screen and the Max 2 44.8 grams, so the Switch is about 50% heavier inch for inch if we judge on screen size alone. The Max 2 feels light, and that was the first thing I noticed when I removed it from the box, but this is undoubtedly a good thing. It's nice and light to carry and hold and is definitely a plus for lengthy gaming sessions. It's lightweight without feeling cheap as a result. This device is Linux based and uses the RK3326 processor, which is a quad-core processor common to handheld devices like this. It has a 5 inch IPS screen, which I must say is gorgeous and is definitely one of the highlights of the handheld. It has a 16:9 aspect ratio with a resolution of 854:480. It has 1 gig of RAM on board and a 4200 mAh battery. A quick look at the buttons and ports on top. We have the power and reset buttons, a switch to toggle the Wi-Fi on and off, a USB-C charging port, 3.5mm headphone jack, another USB-C OTG port for attaching full-size USB peripherals to the device like keyboards or USB flash drives, a microSD card slot, and volume buttons. On the bottom we have what looks like 2 speakers, but one of these is sadly just for show. There's only one speaker. So one major downside of this device is it only outputs mono audio. It's actually not that bad. The volume doesn't really go loud enough for the loss in quality to be noticeable, and it sounds superb through headphones. Personally, I'm either using handhelds at low volume or silent anyway, unless I'm using headphones, so it's not really an issue. It supports micro SD cards from 32 to 256 gig. Before we turn the device on, I have to address an issue I had with this particular device, and that's that the SD card supplied with it failed on me after a couple of hours. I play tested it for a couple of hours and then it wouldn't boot up again. You can see here when I try to boot up that SD, it starts the supplied software called Emulation, but then just displays a black screen. They offered to send a new one, but I said, well, let me try to fix it myself. A great website called Retro Game Core has a good guide on installing some software called Retro Oz, which is actually designed specifically for this device, unlike the software that comes with it. With Retro Oz, there's even an option in the settings to select the Powkiddy RGB10 Max as your device, and it maps the button layout accordingly. Advice online seems to say that replacing your SD card immediately is the thing to do, as the supplied SD cards are of a very poor quality. This seems to be accurate considering mine failed almost immediately. I replaced mine with a 128GB SanDisk microSD I had spare, which can be bought for as little as £15, or you can go for the maximum size of 256 for around twice that. I'd intended to do this anyway, having read up on the device before it arrived, so I didn't mind solving this SD issue on my own. It's a shame that I can't review the supplied software. I'll be reviewing the device based on my experience with the Retro Oz software, but I will say that based on the couple of hours I spent with Emulation, it was very good. The interface looked great and was easy enough to navigate. I suppose I could have installed Emulation on my new SD for the review, but it seemed like an unnecessary time sink, seeing as I intended to install Retro Oz eventually anyway. Seemingly Retro Oz has better SEGA Saturn support, and Saturn emulation has come a long way since I last used devices like this, so it was something I was keen to try. Turning the system on, and of course it's running the Retro Oz software on my new SD card, it boots to the main menu in about 20 seconds. The interface looks superb with a retro synthwave style theme, complete with ambient music. Use the D-pad or left analog stick to cycle through the different systems on offer. The main menu will only show systems that you've loaded ROMs for, so there are of course many more systems available than what you're seeing here. Looking on the SD card, you'll see folders for all sorts, from Atari 2600 to Amiga, DOS PC games, Scum VM, Vectrex Game & Watch, you name it, pretty much every home system up to the Dreamcast, which I think is the latest, as well as handhelds like the PSP and DS. These folders are all created automatically when you follow the instructions for installing Retro Oz. All you have to do is copy ROMs into the relevant folders, or copy the supplied ROMs from the SD card that came with the device. This theme is my preferred style, but there are several others in the settings, including this rather appealing Switch style layout. The layout that was on the original SD was this one called Epic Max Kodi, which also looks fantastic. The best feature of the Max 2 is arguably the fantastic IPS screen, which is clear, very bright, and seems to be of a very high quality. Whatever system you're emulating, it looks great and is viewable from several angles. There is a slight hotspot at the top left of the screen which can get quite hot to the touch, but nothing that's going to burn you, and you're typically not touching the screen anyway. There's no supplied case with the Max 2, so I'd recommend doing something to protect this lovely screen, especially if you're travelling with it, be it a screen protector or some sort of protective sleeve or case to house the handheld itself. The good thing about the Retro Oz software over the original is it lets you choose the RGB10 Max as your device in the settings, meaning it maps all the relevant buttons for you, including the start and select buttons at the bottom and the two at the top. Each system's icon displays the number of games available, i.e. the number of ROMs in its corresponding folder. The software uses several different emulators, mostly RetroArch, and each system has options to change the core used. For example, going into the Super Nintendo settings, we can see it's using RetroArch and SNES 9X. And there are usually a few options if you want to change it, but to be honest I haven't had any call to play with these settings. One thing I will say about these devices is that you'll get the most out of it if you're willing to tinker with the ROMs, folders and settings. It would work fine as a gift for someone who doesn't want to do that. It comes loaded with enough ROMs anyway and it works straight out of the box. Well, it does if your SD card doesn't fail, but you'll get more out of it if you play around with it. When you select a system, you get your game list, which is the list of ROMs you have in the folder. You can favourite games, which by default appear at the top of the list, although you can turn this off. But why would you? It's a nice little feature that saves you trawling through a sea of ROMs to find your favourite game. One annoying thing is that when you favourite a game, it automatically takes you to that game's new position at the top of the list, so you have to go back through all the games to get back to the place you were. A small niggle, but worth noting. Once you've suffered through this by setting all your favourites, it's no longer a problem. When you view the game lists, you can either have a simple list of titles or this video view, which gives a little preview screen or poster or something. Most of these aren't available on mine at the moment as I haven't updated them using the scraper, which you can do over Wi-Fi, but to be honest the simple layout works just fine. Choose a game and the emulator boots in a couple of seconds. Most systems are of course 4:3 aspect ratio, so the software adds a bezel themed on the system selected. This looks really nice and just makes the whole look a bit more polished and presentable. Not every emulator has this, for example the Saturn doesn't have a bezel, but it's no big deal, just more of a bonus when there is one. This may be a setting that isn't switched on that I haven't found for the Saturn, and there are so many settings. In addition to all the RetroOS settings, there are a ton of RetroArch emulation settings, only a fraction of which I've explored. There are myriad settings for each emulator and each system, but for the most part I haven't needed to tinker with them. I have various home consoles and handhelds loaded currently. Nintendo NES, Super Nintendo, Game Boy and Game Boy Color all work flawlessly and look superb. Sega Master System, Game Gear, Mega Drive or Genesis, 32X and Mega CD all work equally as well, as does PC Engine, ATARI LYNX and Neo Geo Pocket Color. I've even tried some of the newer indie releases for the Mega Drive on this and they too work well. The systems that most impressed me were the Game Boy Advance, not because it's difficult to emulate, but purely because of how good it looks running on the 5-inch IPS screen. It looks wonderful. PlayStation is perfectly emulated and I've been spending many hours playing the original Tony Hawk on this over the last 2 weeks. There is absolutely no stuttering with the sound or the gameplay. Dreamcast seems to be very good too. I haven't experienced any issues of yet, but it's possible that the more processor intensive games might cause some slowdown. I've only tested it on some of the more arcadey games like Zero Gunner 2, Marvel vs Capcom and so on. Although I always play it in 4:3 aspect ratio, there is the option to play Dreamcast widescreen as well. The biggest and most welcome surprise is the Sega Saturn emulation, which is just fantastic. Games seem to run pretty well and I've had no issues with controls or significant slowdown nor audio stuttering. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but Saturn emulation has clearly come on leaps and bounds since I last looked. All games, regardless of the system, apart from arcade games of course, can be saved to the SD card, which creates a save file for the game in the same folder as the ROM. To exit a game you just press the start and select buttons together, at which point it asks for confirmation, then press them again to exit. When idle, the main menu displays a show reel of random arcade games displaying the title. Without a doubt the main appeal of these devices has always been the arcade emulation, well, for me at least. The main menu has Final Burn Neo for general arcade emulation, as well as Capcom CPS, Sega Naomi and Neo Geo, and there's an Atomis Wave folder on the SD2, so that must be supported. When they work absolutely flawlessly, but I have had some issues getting certain games to load, one example being SNK's Street Hoop. I'm not sure if this is an issue with the ROMs themselves, so I have to do some further testing to diagnose the issue. But to be fair, overall the ROMs for all systems have almost always loaded, just be aware that there have been a few exceptions. Moving on to more modern handhelds, the PSP emulation is varied. Intensive 3D games seem to be quite stuttery, but simpler 2D games like LOCO ROLO run just fine. The PSP emulator seems to invert the analog stick as well, so you need to fiddle with the settings to get this working right. I think I'll just stick to using my actual PSP for these. Nintendo DS is another one I'd avoid in favour of using original hardware. When playing Mario Kart the frame rate feels jerky, and of course you only have one screen so it displays the two screens side by side, plus you don't have the stylus or touchscreen interface. Nintendo 64 was a big letdown, unfortunately. Diddy Kong Racing, for example, it actually plays very smoothly, but you do get some stuttering during the cutscenes and menus with both the image and the audio. Plus, the analog stick not only sometimes inverts vertically, but inverts left to right. I've tried adjusting this in the settings when it does happen and I can't get it working. It's probably solvable with the right tweaks, but it seems more trouble than it's worth. There are a few other emulators on the menu under the heading ports, such as Beats of Rage, Doom, and bizarrely some newer games like Shovel Knight. Because there's obviously no mouse, Amiga games are mostly ruled out for me on these devices, although I used to play the Scum VM games on my GP2X Wiz as it had a touchscreen and stylus. They wouldn't really work on this device, so stick to PC and Amiga games that lend themselves to the controls. It was a nice surprise seeing some DOS classics like Descent, but sadly the analog controls are all over the place and I couldn't seem to get them right in the control settings. This seems to be an issue with this device and the software. Some of the emulators just don't play ball when it comes to the analog sticks. So bear that in mind. For most old systems and arcade games it's not an issue, and PlayStation, Saturn and Dreamcast all seem fine. It's just a few emulators, which leads me to believe it probably is the settings. The battery is advertised as lasting for up to 8 hours with charging time of 2.5, but in my experience it hasn't lasted that long, so I'd imagine it depends what you're doing with the device. Playing 3D games on the PlayStation, for example, the batteries seem to last for 4 to 4.5 hours, which is still pretty decent. There are loads of other things you can do with the Max 2 that I haven't explored yet, like streaming Steam games. I'm sure its full capabilities open up quite a deep rabbit hole. The Powkiddy RGB10 Max 2 is available at the link below, costing $133, which in my opinion is a great price point for a device like this, especially considering the amount of playtime it's already had in my house over the last couple of weeks. If you're in the market for an all-in-one emulation device that's portable with a decent battery life, then I'd thoroughly recommend it. For me, the pros greatly outweigh the cons, and barring the initial SD card issue, I haven't experienced any real problems with it in day-to-day use. I'm under no obligation to recommend this, but I can honestly say if I didn't already have this device, I'd be ordering one for myself after having used it for the last couple of weeks. It's perfect for travelling on trains or planes, for example, as it's compact and gives you a lot of different systems at your fingertips. Thanks for watching.
Let's look at the funk. Could you stop playing with that radio of yours? I'm trying to get to sleep. Could you stop playing with that radio of yours? I'm trying to get to sleep. Could you stop? Could you stop? I'm trying to get to. I'm trying to get to. Most disturbing. Let's look at the funk.